Je suis très heureux de passer la parole à Julia van Beesel, qui nous vient de l'université de Leuven. On est Leuven en flamand. Et donc je connais Julia depuis longtemps. J'ai eu l'honneur de suivre ses premiers travaux en tant que doctorante. Et bon, maintenant, elle a entamé une carrière très brillante de scientifique, et elle va vous montrer comment on peut combiner à la fois l'approche anatomique de l'étude du mouvement et puis des méthodes informatiques et digitales qui sont, enfin, je trouve très très intéressantes, pas seulement pour comprendre le mouvement d'organismes actuels, mais surtout pour transposer ces résultats, ces connaissances chez les hominines qui ont vécu longtemps avant nous. So, it's your turn.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Julia. Excuse-moi, je ne parle pas français très bien, so I will continue in English, but yeah, I hope I got some assistance for the questions later. I was actually super happy for the second to last question I think you just posed, because you kind of took away my introduction, and that is that I always love looking at the Olympics with the eye of thinking this doesn't work, I think. Well, whatever. How versatile we are in our movements, or like in the capability of the movements that we have. It's not just like the differences in sports and disciplines that we see, it's the differences in environments that we can move in, the differences that we can exert our bodies, our limbs, predominance of upper arm or lower arm exercises, all of these kinds of things always really struck me when looking at the Olympics. But to me, there's one type of sports that has been conspicuously missing for a long time in the Olympics, and that's actually climbing. I just recently learned that rope climbing actually was part of the very first Summer Olympics that happened in Athens in 1896, and it was just there for a couple of turns and then was kicked out, maybe for the reasons that humans aren't as good in climbing as we would wish to be. But climbing, like what I really love, has just recently been reintroduced to the Olympics as part of the sports climbing competition, which happened for the first time again in the last Summer Olympics in Tokyo in 2022. So I'm looking forward to see more of that this year. And why are we talking about climbing? Well, this symposium is called From Origins to Olympics. So what I'm interested in is learning more about our origins. And as Daniel Lieberman already told you, we often, if we want to understand more about our origin, we look into what our closest relatives, non-human apes, are doing today. And when they move, it's often climbing. And because they climb so exceptionally well, there's a general understanding that they have some specialization in their musculoskeleton, some adaptations towards climbing. And if we want to learn more about these adaptations, what we often do is we look at the shoulder, because as you can see from this picture here already, the upper arm plays a vital role in climbing. It is able to, or like helps these apes to reach further away targets, but it also supports the whole body weight when hanging from their arms. And when we look at shoulder anatomy, there is a specific bone that has caught the interest of many comparative anatomists, like I am also, and that's the shoulder bone, the scapula, that sits on the backside of our thorax and connects our upper arm to the thorax. And there are two morphological traits that are especially thought to be very important for adaptations to climbing. And the first one is scapular spine orientation. That's more facing upward, more cranial in non-human apes than it is in us. In us, it's more horizontally oriented. And then we also have the glenoid orientation. That's actually the joint connection towards our upper arm body. And that, again, also faces more cranial, so more upward in non-human apes, and more lateral, more to the side, as it does in humans. And I think Daniel Lieberman also had a little picture showing that there's like a more lateral widespread configuration in humans nowadays. So now you might be tempted to think, well, if the left side is potential adaptations to climbing, and our origin might lie in a more climbing adapted species, then the picture is clear, right? We go from left to right, so we go from a more specialized climbing species to us today. Unfortunately, it's never that easy in biology. So what's wrong about this picture is that what we see on the left side is also a species that still lives today, gorillas. And they are, to us, more like brothers and sisters or like cousins than they are as our parents or our ancestors. And that's because they, the same as us, have their own evolutionary history that actually spans millions of years that gave them enough time to adapt to these highly specialized species that we see today. So what we are actually more interested to learn is this, I'm not sure if this is working at all, but like, let me just use this one. Like what we want to learn more about is what our last common ancestor actually does. So in this region here. And then we also have another similarly important last common ancestor that we don't share with gorillas even anymore, but that we share with chimpanzees and bonobos, so here. And as you can see from the time scale up here, they lived quite some time ago, a couple of million years ago, actually. And unfortunately, what we have left of them is not that much. Actually, from that time region, we don't have that many fossils that can help us get a better understanding of what these last common ancestors looked like, or how they behaved, or how they moved. So instead, what researchers like I and also some others in the public here are doing so far, until we have these fossils, is that we look at the oldest fossils on our own human lineage to get a better understanding of how, like the transitional phase that we went through, but also to get a better understanding of what our last common ancestor might have looked like. And one of the oldest, best preserved scapular fossils, so shoulder bone fossils that we have, is a fossil from the Australopithecus afarensis species. And this fossil is actually 3.5 million years old. So it's kind of halfway in between when our last common ancestors probably last roamed the Earth and us living today. So if we look here at these traits again that we've discussed before, the scapular orientation and the glenoid orientation, what can we now learn from this fossil? Well, what we actually see is that they're kind of intermediate. The spine orientation is more cranial than it is in us, but less so than it is in non-human apes, and the same is true for the glenoid orientation. But what does this actually tell us now about the movement of these species? Well, that's the question I'm very interested in doing some more research on. So what we actually want to know, what we actually want to understand is how can we get from bone to motion, or what is the connection between the form of the bone and the function of the system, in this case, the shoulder system. So yeah, that's actually the topic of my talk today, and also in general about my research. And I'm using biomechanical analyses to get a better understanding of this form-function link in the shoulder, and I especially focus on the muscle moment. Muscle moment, written up here, is basically the ability of a muscle to, or like of a whole system, to turn muscle force into rotational force. So force that happens around a joint, for example. And we can measure or like calculate muscle force through muscle moment arm, and muscle moment can be calculated through muscle moment arm and muscle force. And I want to focus with you on muscle moment arm first, because muscle moment arm actually directly relates to the geometry of a system, so to its shape, right? What we want to understand more about. And that's because moment arm is the perpendicular distance between the muscle line of action or the line of force. So in this case, we have the acromial deltoid here, and this is the midline of this muscle, so basically also the line of force in this case. And then we have the joint rotation center here, and this perpendicular distance between the two is the moment arm. And before we continue to discuss moment arm a little bit further, I'd like to, for those of you who are not up to date with your biomechanics anymore, give you a quick reminder that moment arm is not a single measurement that we take, but it's instead a measurement that we take along joint angles, and that's because it changes with joint angles, and I hope this little movie explains it a little bit better. So whenever we change the orientation of our arm, the path of the acromial deltoid also changes, and with that, the moment arm changes. And now, one trait that is very important about moment arm for our discussion is that it can tell us a little bit more about what kind of action a muscle actually can produce. So let me explain this with another little video. Let's say we are changing the origin side of this acromial deltoid muscle here, and we put it a little bit more downward. Now, all of a sudden, this muscle, when it contracts, actually causes an arm lowering action. And we see this reflected in the negative moment arm. So in the graphs that you will see, like following from this one, whenever you see a positive moment arm, this means the contraction of this muscle would result in an arm raising behavior. And when you see a negative moment arm, this would indicate that this muscle would act as an arm lowerer. How do we measure muscle moment arm? Well, that's also not as easy as you might think. It's actually very hard to measure it experimentally. So what I do instead is I use musculoskeletal models. A little sneak peek was also on one of Daniel's slides. These musculoskeletal models look like this. So they are representations of the skeleton and the muscles of a certain species or specimen. And in this case, we have a human shoulder model here on the right side that's developed by a colleague of mine, AJ Sess. And then we have a shoulder model of the gorilla here on the left side that was developed by myself. And then we can ask these models to do similar tasks, like, for example, arm raising and arm lowering, if we're interested in climbing. And then we can measure muscle moment arm, but also muscle force and muscle moment, and compare it between these two species for the exact same tasks. And the first muscle that we are gonna looking at that gave us very interesting results is the spinal deltoid. It's part of the deltoid complex that in general in humans enables arm raising. So you can also see here it has a positive moment arm and supports the arm raising. Whereas in the gorilla, we found that through the whole elevation cycle, the moment arm was actually negative, indicating that this muscle would act as an arm lowering muscle. But this wasn't really enough for us as an explanation. We wanted to understand what specifically in the shape actually causes this difference in the moment arm. What is the reason for the spinal deltoid acting so differently in the gorilla than it does in humans? So what we did was we used the ability of the musculoskeletal systems to exchange bits and pieces, little parts, to get an understanding of how little sections in the anatomy or in the shape actually affect our moment arm. Okay, so we start with the human configuration, and then we switch the scapula for a more gorilla-oriented scapula, so a more cranial-oriented scapular spine. And what we see is that the origin of this muscle now moved below the joint center. And if we then also switch the whole blade and have a more cranial-oriented glenoid, we see that now the joint center moved even further upward relative to the origin of this muscle. And this actually enables this arm lowering behavior, or this arm lowering function that we can see in this muscle. So to summarize this finding, if we have the gorilla configuration, we see that the joint rotation center sits above the origin of this muscle, and then we have an arm lowering capability. And if the origin is actually the one that's above the joint rotation center, then we have an arm raising ability. But moment arm also has another very important feature, and that is that whenever, just mathematically, we enlarge the moment arm, we also get a larger muscle moment. Or to say it in a different way, if you want to keep the same muscle moment, you can also reduce the muscle force and enhance your muscle moment arm to get the same muscle moment. So you can basically reduce your energy expenditure. And let me explain this a little bit again, what this means geometrically on the example of the acromial deltoid. So this comes from the tip of the acromion spine, the very tip of the spine that we were talking about before. And if we would now extend this distance here between this tip and the glenoid, we would actually get a much, much larger moment arm. And that would be the case throughout the whole elevation cycle. So this is how, in theory, the shape of a muscle can also affect the magnitude of the moment arm. And for this, we're going to look at the arm-lowering muscles themselves, two of the main arm-lowering muscles to be specific, the teres major here on the left side, and the pectoralis major on the right side. And for those of you who know these muscles a little bit better, we are going to actually focus just on the lower part of the pectoralis major, so the sternocostal part for now. And as you can see in humans, the moment arm is negative, so both of them act as arm-lowering muscles, as we know they also do. So they pull the arm downward relative to the scapula. Now, if we put the moment arm of the gorilla in there, we see that they are more negative. So they are better at arm lowering, or like have, like some kind of adaptation towards arm lowering in their geometry compared to us. And again, we used the ability of the musculoskeletal models to exchange little pieces and parts to get a better understanding of what exactly in the anatomy causes this difference in the moment arm. And so the main cause, you will see shortly, is that, again, we start with the human configuration, measure the moment arm. And then we're gonna swap the human humerus for a size-adjusted gorilla humerus. And what we see is that the moment arm actually enlarges a lot between these two configurations. And if we then swap the human humerus for a gorilla scapula, we can see at some point that the moment arm again gets bigger, but the difference between the second version and the third version is not that much. So the actual enlargement that is causing this very, very much larger negative muscle moment arms in gorillas is actually because of the middle one, the humerus anatomy, and not because of the scapular anatomy. And it's not just the overall humeral anatomy, but it's actually the more distal insertion of this muscle along the humerus in gorillas compared to humans that causes this much greater moment arm enhancement. And we see this in the teres major, but we also see it, again, exactly similarly in the pectoralis major. So also here, we have a much more distal insertion. So now I was talking a lot about moment arm. Maybe for some of you, that makes sense as for an eye, because as I said, it's directly relates to the geometry of a system, whereas muscle force that we kind of neglected so far doesn't. And that's because muscle force really relates to the muscles themselves. And unfortunately, muscles are soft tissue, so they don't fossilize. And we can't get a lot of information about the muscles from our prehistoric friends. So what people are doing nowadays to get a better estimate of muscle force is they are looking into muscle volume, because it, to some degree, relates to muscle force. And they do this by doing so-called volumetric reconstructions. So they basically take the fossils, the skeletons, and then they reconstruct what the muscles could have been, and they use information from today living species to guide these reconstructions. However, as with all reconstructions, they are kind of biased to the reconstructor, to the modeler. And I was wondering if there isn't maybe something that the bones can tell us a little bit more about how well these reconstructions actually are. And for that study, I focused on the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and subscapularis muscles, so these three muscles you can see here. And I focused on these three muscles because they have very, very broad origin sites on the scapula. So the supraspinatus muscle comes from this whole area here, the infraspinatus from this whole area down here, and the subscapularis from the underside, so from this side basically of the scapula. And like, I haven't really measured it, but it's like about 80–90% of the volume that actually sits on top of these origin sites. So basically, most of the volume is to some degree already reflected in these attachment sites, and there's only a little part of the volume that actually extends beyond it. So I was wondering if there's a relationship between the size of these attachment sites and the volume of these muscles. So what we did was we took a couple of long-legged hominoids and we dissected them and measured muscle volume, but also the area of these origin sites. And then we did a correlation analysis where we wanted to understand how, or like if the muscle origin area down here correlates with the muscle volume up here. And for those of you who love statistics, yes, there is a correlation, and it's statistically significant, and even more interesting, it's a linear relationship. So that means, like as you can see here, and that means that we can calculate a line equation. So we can basically now, with this equation, you could give me any kind of measurement you took of an origin site, and I could tell you just from the size of this origin site what kind of muscle volume we would expect. And that would actually give us a tool to now evaluate these volume reconstructions. So we could also measure the origin sites of these bones and then calculate what, from the origin site, we would the muscle volume expect to be like. And then we can compare this to these reconstructions we already did to see how well they fit these expectations. So to summarize, we hopefully learned today that a more cranial-oriented glenoid and scapular spine orientation can change muscles or give muscles an arm lowering rather than as an arm raising function. And a more distal insertion along the humerus can enhance the action of the arm lowering muscles. And then finally, we also have a new tool that helps us evaluate reconstructions of muscle volumes from the past. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to thank all of my collaborators for helping in all of these studies. Thank you.